Hello, photography enthusiasts. You might be a good photographer, but have you been good at reading images? Have you been able to evoke emotions through your images? Or have you landed into your masterpiece? This video will covering that all the principles of photography, or I could say the principles of creating a masterpiece. The four principles that I'm mentioning here: direction, focal point, contrast, message. Now I'll give you a handful how to keep that in mind in the later part of the video. But let's get started. So let's begin with recalling the principles that were direction, focal point, contrast, and message. Okay, we'll begin with direction. So do you see some signifiers in this image? Like the very first interaction with this image is that of the chair. Okay, and next comes that boy. Okay, now what makes your eyes to guide from this chair to directly that boy? Now let me explain you this with the help of grids in terms of contrast. Okay, so this is my grid. Now what's happening in this image? Now check for all the grids. Now the grid on the very left hand side on the top, extremely less crowded. Okay, and the image, the rest part of the grid is extremely crowded. Now we all know about and how energy flows from high potential to low potential. Quite similarly, our eyes do flow from high potential to low potential. Okay, so that very grid makes for less contrast than this very image and a high contrast image. So eventually you will be forced to move to a level of low contrast because you want to take some breathe. Okay, it's like somebody stifled you to death and then you want to take a breath. Okay, similarly, so that makes for my contrast on the very left hand side. This portion makes for a good contrast for my image to be absorbed, my message to be there. Okay, now comes, as I said, we'll switch off the grid and we'll switch on the direction. We'll switch on the focal point. So that very contrast makes up for my focal point. So that's how I decide where my what the photographer wants to say to me or what the photographer wants to convey through this image. So we get to that point. Now we analyze, yeah, that is my focal point of the image. Now that is where I need to look. And that is where my message lies from all this visual. Now once that is done, we'll define the direction. Now remember we said about direction. So why we thought about direction? Because if you have some idea of the perspective and how perspective works, this make up for a vanishing line. And my chair, the inverted chair, seems to project you through the image to that kid. Okay, so this makes for a good image. Else it will be any normal photo, taking flowers or something like that. If these principles work for you, you're gonna rock every photograph. So photography isn't just about having a camera, but you should need to develop that visual language within your brain. And if you're able to do that, you're good enough. We'll move on to our next image. Okay. So let's analyze this image. Well, we left the message part. That's your homework. Do it, do it, and let me know in the comments below. Okay. So this image, we need to analyze this image and tell is this image good enough or is just usual. Okay. So we begin with contrast. We'll begin with focal point. So what's the contrasting feature of this image? See, you have a middle grid already there, right? So the grid on the left part, on the very first grid, and if you consider it the Z way, the very first grid, in terms of further thing, that it is a high contrast image, and that is where I need to look. That will again capture your image from your focal point to those points. Okay. So your focal point drives your viewpoint from the chair to the masks. Now, what made up for the contrast? Let's understand for the contrast first. See, what's happening here is you have a complete image. Now, there are multiple colors all around the scene. Now, the only thing has single color. The highest contrast is the chair. Okay. Now, if I remove all the images behind the contrast, just see a chair. Okay. That chair makes up for a good contrast. You get that? And once that is defined, we come up to the point of focal point, direction, contrast, and everything else. Everything else is secondary. Now the last part is the message. Okay. See, that's about analyzing the image. But to the viewer, who is not a photographer, he will only be concerned about the message you are giving. Okay, that's a good image, that's good, it looks viscerally beautiful. But what about the message you are giving to you? Okay, moving on. So to the message part. So what message are you deriving from this? Let me help you one with this. The former one is still your homework. So this very chair and the masks define people put on different types of masks, different types of personalities to keep improving themselves, to get to a point, to get to a goal they have set. Okay, and you can take it at any visual language. Let me know what you think of this image. So that's how we deal with all the principles. And before you learn photography, it's quite essential that you keep these principles in mind. Enjoy. Enjoy it.